Everyone, welcome to the official book launch for The Rhythm of Images, Cinema Beyond Measure. Thank you all so much for coming today on this Friday morning or early morning for those on the West Coast, or late at night, depending on where you're zooming in from. We're truly delighted to host this event. I'm Maggie Hennefeld. I'm one of the co-editors of Cultural Critique, along with Cesare Casarino, Simona Sani, John Mowitt, and Frida Koto. And I'd also really like to thank our assistant editors, Alexis Zongi and Jess Farrell, for all their hard work organizing this event. And of course, the University of Minnesota Press, which publishes both the journal and the book series in which The Rhythm of Images was published. And on that note, all of the attendees today, if you don't already have your copy or you're looking for a great gift for a friend, University of Minnesota Press is offering a 40% discount until June 1st using the code MN89350. So maybe Alexis or Jess, could you post that discount code and book link in the chat? We'll post that in the chat in just a minute. A few quick orders of business before we dive into the festivities. Please be advised that we are recording the events today, and they will be archived on our Manifold website, so feel free to adjust your webcam or chat settings accordingly. We'll open today with a brief presentation by our celebrated author, Domietta Torlasco, followed by a series of responses from our 5 panelists. Each respondent will speak for approximately 10 to 15 minutes, and we'll go in alphabetical order, so beginning with Tom Conley, then Akira Lippit, then John Mowitt, then Tiziana Terranova, and last but certainly not least, Amy Villarejo. And after that, we'll give Domietta a brief opportunity to respond to her respondents, if she so chooses, after which finally we'll open the floor for general discussion and Q&A. So the event is scheduled to conclude at 1 p.m., give or take, and given our very robust docket, I will now pass the baton to my co-moderator, Cesare Casarino.
Thank you, Maggie, and thank you everybody for being here. I am going to introduce Domietta Torlasco, who will begin with some remarks. Domietta Torlasco is a critical theorist, filmmaker, and professor of Italian and comparative literature at Northwestern University. Her research focuses on questions of memory and technology, life and labor, queer materiality, and cinema's potential to reimagine histories and forms of life. Torlasco is the author of 3 books: The Time of the Crime, Phenomenology, Psychoanalysis, Italian Film, published by Stanford University Press in 2008, The Heretical Archive, Digital Memory at the End of Film, by Minnesota University Press, 2013, and The Rhythm of Images, Cinema Beyond Measure, Minnesota University Press, 2021, the book that we will be discussing today. Her film essays have screened at national and international venues, including the Galerie Campagne Première in Berlin, the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, the Pacific Film Archive in Berkeley, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles. As co-editor of the journal Cultural Critique, as well as the Cultural Critique Books series, one of 5 co-editors, as Maggie has already told us, as co-editor, I would like to say just how wonderful it was to work with Domietta Torlasco on this truly stunning and, to me, genuinely moving book. A book that gives one hope for rhythms and forms of life counter to and beyond the misery of our present. I would like to express my gratitude to Domietta for having written this most compelling book, and please join me in welcoming Domietta Torlasco.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, thank you for being here, and special thanks also to those who've made it happen, and those who've agreed to speak about my book. Cesare, thank you for those wonderful remarks. So I can presume that everyone gathered here today has had a chance to read the book in its entirety, or even in part. So let me say a few words about what I see the book is trying to do. The task is not that easy because as those who might have read it, as those who have read it might attest, I designed the book in such a way as to be resistant to quick summary or forms of capture. This is also why I struggled as I did when it came to producing encapsulations for the publisher when the book was going into print. It was probably the most difficult thing I had to do. But for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it yet, I'd say that the book has three primary aims. First, to elaborate a notion of rhythm that prioritizes radical difference, a difference that is not caught in a system of equivalences, absolute rather than relative, resistant or even indifferent to exchange, value, valuation, fixed positionality. So in order to do so, I go back, I retrieve Benveniste's interpretation of the Greek term rhythmos, rhythm, which meant in Benveniste's reading, named a momentary improvised form. After Benveniste, Roland Barthes and Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe also draw on this notion of rhythm as momentary improvised form in order to challenge the priority given to vision, to the visual over the acoustic in the case of Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, and in the case of Barthes to envision some kind of socialist utopia, a strange form of socialist utopia in which people come to live together, but each according to its own rhythm, without a supervisor or controller. So in Benveniste, in quite a detailed essay, explains that contrary to what we might assume, rhythmos, which is derived from rain, to flow, has nothing to do with the regularity of waves. Rhythmos instead is a momentary improvised form or configuration, in opposition to schema, which was named a fixed form. So one could speak of rhythmos in relation to the form of a letter, the arrangement of a garment, and even a disposition of the character or mood. So rhythmos is a fluctuation, a configuration, a constellation that is in excess of stability, fixity, and even cohesiveness. It was according to Benveniste, it was Plato who set rhythm in order, so to speak, by appropriating the term to define the movement of bodies in a dance, according to a metron or external measure. Thus, normalized rhythm could fulfill the aesthetic requirements of a unified political community. But before becoming order in movement, rhythm was a fluctuation, a form that does not coalesce, a fleeting, fugitive form, a particular manner of flowing that could be attributed to images, sounds, and affects alike. So I take this notion of rhythm as undeveloped, as it has remained in the Western tradition, as a point of departure, as an offspring for thinking about rhythm in an expanded sense, as a mode of being in the sensible, a mode of being on the sensible that is informed by radical difference. So together with this attempt to elaborate a notion of rhythm that prioritizes radical difference, the book also attempts to trace the contours of an image practice that resists our ongoing depletion of the sensible, what Stigler would call our current symbolic misery. And in tracing these necessarily blurred, imperfect, and intermittent contours, I look back at Italian neorealism and locate the emergence, which I don't consider as an absolute origin, far from it, but as a transition in 20th century image culture. So I look back at Italian neorealism and locate the emergence of a new rhythmic impulse at the heart of what is usually celebrated as a cinema of duration and, by extension, continuity. I go back to Umberto D, for instance, and then gather constellations, De Sica's Umberto D, and then gather constellations of films and video projections that, while emerging in the force field of European cinema, also erode its boundaries and subjects from within. Here, fluidity in these works and in my interpretation of these works, fluidity is not automatically synonymous with continuity or gradual predictable becoming. Instead, fluidity is characterized by an intermittence, a discontinuity, and an unpredictability of forms that reach beyond telos and prophet. With respect to both trajectories, to both aims, the origin to which I return, Benveniste's Rhythmos in one case and Italian neorealism in the other, the origin to which I return belongs to a futural past. The rhythms or configurations that I pursue are to be invented rather than found, invented as they are performed in a process of reviewing and rewriting. Now we come to a third pervasive, an aim that cuts across the previous two, and that is in the book I try to engage the reader viewer in a process of reconfiguration of the sensible that would temporarily, at least, upset and rework boundaries of all kinds, but also including corporeal boundaries, which I consider material and symbolic at once, and would a process of reconfiguration that would transform our sense of entanglement in the materiality of things, that would allow us to image a place where bodies no longer end at the skin, to quote Donna Haraway, bodies no longer end at the skin or include at best other bodies encapsulated by skin. So this engagement, this kind of engagement, I consider as a kind of spectatorship and also scholarship that reaffirm the fluidity of forms against the production of a stability, fixity, and continuity that is predicated on exclusivity. A stability that instead a kind of fluidity that cuts across and interferes with a number of other practices, and that attempts to produce rhythm as what allows for approximation, imperfection, for a supplement and idios. And this is Roland Barthes. Rhythm as that which allows for what doesn't fit the structure or would have been made to fit. In order to pursue or realize or perform this mode of engagement, I write by privileging metonymy and lateral displacements over metaphor and substitutions. But I wanna, because in a way I was trying to think as some of the films I was writing about in these films, and hopefully, perhaps in my way of writing, metonymy, displacement, the metonymies I rely upon are generative of intervals, of fissures, so that they continue to weave a disjunctive, they weave a disjunctive texture as they move from one side to the other, from one time to the other. Now, how well these aims are reflected, performed in the book itself is something that will emerge from our conversation today, which I'm keenly looking forward, and I honestly couldn't have asked for better interlocutors. But before I turn things over to them, though, let me just add a couple of words about how myself see the book now that I read it. I read it again under mutated personal, but also collective historical circumstances. So were I to rewrite it now, I think I do, let's say, a couple of things differently. And again, I'm not talking about adding, I'm conceiving of what I'm about to say, not in terms of addition, adding things, producing a plus, a more, but what I'm about to say, I'm thinking about what I'm about to say, the things that I would have done in terms of differentiation, as a further differentiation that I would now introduce into the book. And the first thing that I would develop, that is differentiate further, relates to the memory of water, which of course the book Connecting Fluidity runs throughout the work. And I would connect the memory of water to the work done in critical race theory, engage with works like John Akomfra's Vertigo C, but also with Fred Moten's work on the flesh, about which I'd also written, and I touch upon which I touch in this book. But Fred Moten's interpretation of the flesh as what constitutes the most radical endangerment of the system of value, of the symbolic and the discursive. The other thing that I would have done, and which connects in a way to an expansive and interpretation of the flesh and its generative indefinite productivity, what I would have done is also to speak about the rhythms, the configurations I was tracing in terms of entanglement, of diffraction, of interference. And here I'm referring specifically to the work of Karen Barada, and also to what Vicky Kirby does with Merleau-Ponty and quantum entanglements. And I believe this might, in a way, this is what I'm trying to do in the book I'm currently writing. And this would better enable me to attend to cinema's scattered body, a body which I consider as including the here, there, where I write the films I watch, but together with other often non-human actors, for instance, the algorithms that bring out certain films when I do a search, and non-human actors whose inventiveness is not subordinated to our own. So I would have, I pushed a number of junctures for an interpretation of cinema as a dispersed and heterogeneous apparatus, but I think now I would try to write about these films even as they are given to me while, for instance, I'm trying to collect materials for a short video that revolves around found footage, and to interface with computer, and to take into account also the way in which computer windows work in metonymically and metaphorically in giving me, in providing me this, in offering or at times imposing materials through which I can produce certain kinds of arrangements. I'd stop here, and maybe I even went a little longer than I thought I would, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Domietta, for those incredibly evocative remarks. It is my pleasure to introduce our first respondent, Tom Conley, who is the Abbott Lawrence Lowell Professor of Visual and Environmental Studies and Romance Languages and Literatures at Harvard University. Professor Conley is a prolific author. His most recent books include Cartographic Cinema, published in 2007, An Errant Eye, Topography and Poetry in Early Modern France, published in 2011, and A Fleur de Page, please excuse my French pronunciation, Voir et lire le texte de la Renaissance, published in 2014. With Jefferson Klein, he co-edited the Wiley Blackwell Companion to Jean-Luc Godard. Among his 250 articles and book chapters include contributions to the history of cartography 3, cinema and modernity, Michael Haneke, the epic film, and these are all separate titles, Opening André Bazin, and of course, Burning Darkness, A Half Century of Spanish Cinema. His awards include fellowships from the American Council for Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Guggenheim Foundation. And I just learned that he has a new monograph coming out next week titled Action, 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 The Early Cinema of Raoul Walsh, which will be published by SUNY University Press in their Horizon Cinema series. And again, it is coming out next week. And I've also been told that it contains over 70 illustrations. So on that note, please join me in welcoming Tom Conley.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. I'm right in the thick of a conference here, but well, I found a good quiet space, and so maybe we can proceed. I prepared a PowerPoint here. I don't know if we want to include that or not, but I've got it. Let's see if I can somehow get it up onto the screen. Let's see, how do we do this? Do I go to a share screen? Is that what I do? Let's see, share screen.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah,
Yeah.
I got it. Okay, got it. Yep, we got it. Here it is. Yep. Let's see if it comes in now. It's no, is it coming in? Yeah, your share screen is paused. Let's see, share, the Zoom share, okay. I should probably start it all over again, maybe. Here, let's see, share screen. There, try this. Okay. Oh, gee, well, if it's not sharing, I'll just read. I have a small text here that we can work with, maybe. Maybe just try it once more again here, just once more. So let's, oh, what this, here's this, and screen sharing. I think maybe we're going to get it here. I think we're almost there. We're almost there. Let's see, we want to screen. Oh, gee. Here we go. I think we're going to get it here. Oh, if I can get this over here. Oh, gee. Let's see. Here we are. All right, let's try this. Does it come in?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good. Okay.
It was a lot of suspense.
Oh, come on. So here, let me, I'll start here. So, yeah, we'll go with this. We'll go with this one here. Now, in the open instant, a subsection of medium, the final chapter of Rhythm of Images, Domietta Torlasco cites Rosalind Krauss, who, and I quote here, takes issue with a dream of instantaneity as it relates to modernist paintings, a pursuit of an abstracted and heightened visuality, unquote. Torlasco cites a conversation the art historian had had with Michael Fried. Quote, do you know who Frank Stella thinks is the greatest living American? Michael asked me one day. And then, grinning at the sheer brilliance of the answer, he said it was Ted Williams. the great hitter of the Red Sox. I quote again, he sees faster than any living human, Michael said. His vision is so fast that he can see the stitching on the baseball as it comes over the plate, 90 miles an hour, but he sees the stitches, so he hits the ball out of the park. That's why Frank thinks he's a great genius, unquote. Torlasco notes that what I've called the temporal enclosure reaches here its own peculiar apex, and adding, quote, the anecdote exposes a chain of imaginary male identifications. The player, cherished by the artist, cherished by the critic, is someone who allegedly sees outside of duration in a moment of pure presentness. The masculine privilege of the scene is no doubt offsetting. Two men praise the genius of another, the greatest player ever to hold a 35-inch Louisville slugger in his hands. John Mowitt will know this. The last player to compile a season's batting average of 400, 1941. Among others, Williams' monikers included Teddy Baseball, the Kid, the Thumper, the Splendid Splinter. Now, is Torlasco disgruntled by two men who prefer not to talk about art, but about baseball, the game whose craft and subtleties, with some exceptions, are lost upon many. Exceptions for me include Michel Buteau, with whom I shared baseball memories, and then I took Lyotard to a game. He went bananas. He said, "This is too sublime for me." And then I took Julien Gracq to a game, and he thought it was just fabulous work on space and so on. Anyway, so I closed that. So Fried's grin, and then Fried, remember, was an early champion of Merleau-Ponty, or Frank Stella, star, as it were, who famously pronounced that painters worth their salt must produce 90 canvases per year, forces recall of the Ruthmos, of the most generous and rhythmic artist ever to step up to the plate. Williams faces a fastball. In the jargon of the game, he faces heat thrown at 90 miles an hour, and so on and so on. Now, in this genial treatment of Ruthmos rather than ruthless, reminding us of Babe Ruth, Torlasco's sense of the open instant would be the millisecond between the pitcher's release of the ball and its passage from the mound to the plate at a distance of 60 feet and 6 inches. The open instant would have Williams perceiving the pitch, deciding to swing, torquing his hips and shoulders, left elbow straight and high, his fingers and not his hands, gripping the bat, turning and smacking. As if evoking a baseball in flight, its cowhide bound by 108 stitches of red yarn, Torlasco lays stress on the, quote, interlaced aspects of this other visuality, in which space and time lose clarity and immediacy. And she adds, because form is acted against and repeatedly submitted to a process of dissolution, unquote, dissolution, which can be taken as the whiplash and crack of the bat, an internal constitutive transgression. The analogy makes sense now when we realize, much in the spirit of what Domietta describes about film and feeling, that between a complex, open-ended, ever-changing modulation of affective energies, in her words, quote, irregular rhythmic patterning defines the incredibly complex relation of strategy and tactic shared by the pitcher and batter, or closer to home, the artwork and its participant. Now, the cover and the 14 screen grabs that punctuate Rhythm of Images are indicative. Set above the title, subtitle, and the name of the author, printed in white sans serif type that progressively blends into the cover's red background amidst a bright color field, two copies of a black and white still from the famous submarine sequence of La Talente are shown, superimposed, slightly staggered, the one both over and under the other. They vibrate. We immediately recognize in the role of Juliette, one of the three J's, with Jean and Jules, majuscules that confuse one personage with the others, Dita Parlot, the actress whom Julien Duvivier had cast as Denise Baudu in Au Bonheur des Dames, 1930, a late silent and epic adaptation of Zola. There we have it. Now on the cover of the Rhythm of Images, this bright-eyed Juliet looks forward and outward. Although stilled here, her blonde locks, viewers recall, are wafting in a breeze. Behind her, in close-up, faded, resembling a great grouper, the face of Jean d'Asté, is shown underwater swimming, which figures 1 to 3, pages 24 to 26, confirm. He looks for Juliet's image in the water of the canal, legend of figure 1, while in figure 2, Jean emits bubbles from his mouth, reminiscent of the signs of characters we think in the cloudy balloons of comic strips, while he searches for Juliet, dressed in a diaphanous robe, her arms high, who pivots languidly in what the legend calls their, quote, dance of the atoms, writes Domietta. In a scene of surreal beauty, Jean is shown swimming underwater, his eyes wide open and his mouth tightened. The waltz that Père Jou's phonograph is playing on board remains audible, transforming his movements into a strange dance. Now we can almost feel the density of the water, the pressure it exercises on the swimmer, and what looks like a swarm of air bubbles reminds us of the animality of breathing, unquote. Beautiful sentence, by the way. Animality or spirituality. If spirit, esprit, is breath, it is also wit, as in a jeu d'esprit, and that wit is cloaked in menace in the couple's separation. Jean, looking for what he can't find, but also when leaping from the gunwales of the boat to immerse his head in the cold November water, see if I can find it here. All this is out there, okay. In the canal, he opens an oil slick that pollutes the canal, and which by extension flows through a polluted world. Jean and Juliette are joined, as Torlasco brilliantly concludes the monograph, quote, in simultaneity as difference they have in common, unquote. But in a better atmosphere, we see this when the isolated péniche, pun and no pun intended, is aimed in the last shot of the film. It may be that the waltz on the soundtrack doubles the tune heard in the mirrored shots of the Song Palace at the film's end, in which the store window Gaumont, the producer's name, is printed, that was deployed to sell the movie. Vigo, who had innovated in using underwater photography in his sensuous film immortalizing Jean Tavis, the swimming champion of France, who was outdone only by Tarzan, that is Johnny Weissmuller, who swam, I think, 100-meter freestyle in 50 seconds in the 20s. And that was the record for 17 years. And also Buster Crabbe, hero of many serials. But in all events, by stressing atmospheric and muscular modulation, Torlasco succeeds in disengaging the sequence at the cost of a clumsy formula from some of the economic indicators of its so-called conditioned possibilities. Now, in another waking up, in the subsection of labor, the second chapter of Rhythm of Images, we have these shots from Umberto D, figures 5 and 7, that can be read in a similar fashion. Revisiting the maid's awakening in Umberto D, Domietta describes, quote, a veritable choreography of domestic labor. Quote, a poetic documentation of a series of routine gestures, unquote, in which panning shots, quote, keep her in sight as she walks around the kitchen table and almost stops to light a match, turn on the gas stove, take the kettle out of the cabinet, open the water faucet, drown the ants crawling above the sink, clear the table, put the kettle on the stove, look down, touch her pregnant belly, sit on a chair to grind the coffee, and extend her leg to close the door. See if we can get invoking Deleuze and Bazin. Torlasco notes how the sequence, quote, generates a rhythm that is both tentative and fluid, like a cautious leap. That's beautiful. I love that wonderful oxymoron. A cautious leap, and marked by what, from the viewpoint of both housework and film editing, is sheer gratuitousness, unquote, a rhythmos, that, quote, upsets the fictitious equation of flow and continuity, and at the same time does away with the thought of interruption as a stoppage of time, which ultimately remains a privilege of the, quote, male subject. Now, rhythmos here is a fleeting, irregular form in words she borrows from Roland Barthes, another male authority, I guess, who is, quote, the exact opposite of an inflexible, implacably regular cadence, unquote. Now, after calling Maria a child, and no sooner a maid, Domietta concludes, set against the relentless routine of housework, the maid's gesture rediscovers this other rhythm, subtle, eccentric, emerging as one intermittent configuration rather than the sum of autonomous movements. Now, the legend below figure 5, a medium close-up of Maria's lower body, displaying her left leg extended and her right leg bent. When reclining in a chair, she puts her hand to the coffee grinder, quote, I quote, Maria's variation on her daily choreography of housework is seen. Now, figure 6, let's see, I want to get to this one. A medium shot which portrays Maria in the kitchen, her eyes half shut, her right hand about to turn the handle of the coffee grinder posed upon her midsection, she gently holds with her left, is included dismissively. Quote, as Maria is balancing an editing cut that is not needed, unquote. Figure 7, immediately following on the next page, showing Maria stretching her leg to close the door with the tip of her toe, is summed up in the legend, quote, Maria's acrobatic gesture, or can she do it? Then, unquote. Now, to the knowledge of this reader, unspoken and unsaid in most of the accounts of this sequence, the mise en scène invites the viewer to consider Maria associating coffee seeds with a seed in her uterus, thus to sense that turning the crank at odds with herself, she would abort an unwanted fetus, to pulverize it. Better not to bring into the world an unwanted and unneeded human. In a post-war Catholic setting, the idea of a murderous latency would be heresy. Bazin describes the scene as a cavalcade of smaller and smaller events. Cesare deals with housework as labor, but what he implies here, and what we imagine in reading him, Maria's thoughts about or also include the labor of childbirth, or a fetus in a coffee grinder. Now, dwelling on, quote, pure optical situations, unquote, Deleuze skitters away from the pregnancy of the painfully enduring sequence, and it is painful. Torlasco seems closest to the point, and she's right there when she notes remaining unsteadily suspended there in the small gaps or slivers drawn by the edit, the cut or incision she calls needless, being is in fact much needed. Here and elsewhere, Domietta's self-reflexive, always gracious, always graceful readings of this film and others attests not only to an uncommon sensitivity or empathy, what Warringer and others called Einfühlung, with the films she carries with her, but also a contagious pleasure that goes with rhythmos. An endnote. During my childhood in New York in the 1950s, whenever the Boston Red Sox visited Yankee Stadium in a perennially losing cause, reserving seats as close to home plate as possible, my father carried a 16mm camera that he aimed at the batter's box when Ted Williams came to bat. He filmed them in slow motion to impart to my brother and to me the rhythm of his relation with the open instant when suddenly, in total silence and an unabashed admiration, 60,000 vociferous, obnoxious Yankee fans came to deafening silence in watching, admiring the rhythm of their adversary, the master who could master the most difficult sport a feat has ever known, a sport has ever known, hitting a baseball. Torlasco here, she too hits it out of the park. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Tom. I'll now introduce our next panelist.
Okay.
Oh, yes. Akira, do you have a screen share also, or are you just going to be speaking?
Oh,
All right.
I have no screen share and I have no forthcoming manuscript too. So.
Good to know on both counts. So I'm delighted to introduce Akira Mizuta Lippit, who is the Vice Dean of Faculty in the School of Cinematic Arts and Professor in the Division of Cinema and Media Studies at USC. He's also a Professor of Comparative Literature and East Asian Languages and Cultures. His expansive interests include world cinemas, critical theory, Japanese film and culture, experimental film and video, and visual studies. His published work reflects these areas exemplified by his 4 books, X Cinema, From a Theory of Experimental Film and Video, Atomic Light, Shadow Optics, Electric Animal, Toward a Rhetoric of Wildlife. His books have the most amazing titles, and his most recent work, Cinema Without Reflection, Jacques Derrida's Ecopoiesis and Narcissism Adrift. And he's currently completing a book manuscript on contemporary Japanese cinema. He's also the general editor of the journal Discourse and active in the independent film community where he programs events and interviews filmmakers. So please join me in welcoming Professor Akira Lippit.
Thank you, Maggie, and thank you, everybody, for this opportunity to join such an august group of panelists and friends and people who I've admired from a distance for so long. Having to follow Tom Conley is never an easy task, but having all this baseball put in my head has really thrown me off a little bit and just made me think about so many ways to think this through. And the idea of Lyotard calling baseball sublime at an actual game is one that's going to just, I'm going to end up dreaming about this. So thank you, Tom. It's going to come out in some weird script that plays out of my head.
He was lovely.
Approaching. I will say this, though. Michael Fried, who was one of my dissertation advisors, once told me that 2 things that I'll just add to Tom's point as a footnotes, that he and Frank Stella, who met in middle school, bonded over their appreciation of Manet's Déjeuner Célèbre. And so from a very early age, and perhaps even pre-baseball, they bonded in this kind of precocious appreciation of French painting. Michael also told me he adopted a daughter very late in life, and he told me once that he very proudly showed her Michael Jordan, who was still playing for the Bulls at that time, and said to his daughter, "This is the most important man with the name Michael that you will ever know in your life." So there was a certain kind of sports, how should I say, disavowal and kind of self-deprecation that Michael Fried was also capable of. Approaching Domietta's work is about the most difficult thing you can do because of its brilliance, as Tom has pointed out, because of her eloquence, the subtlety of her thought, but also, and of her expression, I should add, but also the incredible erudition and range of her work. Having also seen at length many of her film works, the task is especially daunting for me, just because it's almost difficult, or impossible, I should say, to situate her work within a certain location. The kinds of things that give us the sense of comfort, let's say, of space and contour, of an understanding of where we might look, were we to look for Domietta, the spaces that we would seek out. And I want to start sort of just with a couple of quick reflections, and these will only be reflections, incomplete necessarily, and suggestions, I hope, for Domietta and I and everyone here to continue this incredible conversation that she has launched for us, and which she's included us in. And I wanted to start with the subtitle of her work, Cinema Beyond Measure, and to point out, to put an emphasis on the word beyond, because I think it resonates throughout this work, to put it into a certain alignment with the notion of rhythm, and then to pick up on this notion of measure. The term rhythm, which suggests musicality, which suggests things like tempo and pacing, something that we talk about from time to time with relationship to cinema. We talk about the way in which cinema can be measured, as it were, in fact, even evaluated by the kinds of rhythms that they produce. And I think we have perhaps somewhat belatedly come to understand that among the criteria that we ascribe to authorship is the capacity and the ability to manage and maintain, to really situate and produce rhythm. Recently, we hear often about slow cinema, and we hear about filmmakers like Tsai Ming Liang or Ho Xiaoshen, and more recently, Apichatpong, and the idea that these are masters precisely because they have a certain understanding or relationship to the quality of rhythm within cinema. And I think the many examples, and Tom focused on Jean Vigo, and there's so many here for Rocky, Ackerman. I'm going to turn a little bit later to Lynch, just out of purely selfish reasons, because this is another one of the monographs that will not be forthcoming anytime soon that I'm working on. And to talk a little bit about that. But this idea of measure, I was struck by in just thinking a little bit about the term, because in relationship to the idea of rhythm, one thinks of measure as a critical form within music. And a measure in music would be sort of the space or the contours or the confines in which one would locate things like beat and tempo, right? And so to be beyond measure suggests already a certain kind of musicality or rhythmicality that is in excess of, or that cannot be contained by or restrained by the notion of measure. And expanding more broadly to the way in which we use, in a more colloquial sense, the notion of measure, it is the way in which we ascertain the limits or the let's say the volume, the various kind of contours of a thing, of anything in that sense. And so to measure something is to give it a certain kind of place, a certain sort of geometric within the world. And to be beyond measure is therefore to be in excess of not only what we call a measurement, but I would add the capacity to measure, the ability to measure at all. So I'm intrigued by this notion of cinema beyond measure as the subtitle to a book, to a work that you were calling The Rhythm of Images, and already to suggest that at work here in The Rhythm of Images is already an impossibility, is already the suggestion of something that will take place in excess of our ability to measure, which is also to say to define and to concretize, to establish, and perhaps to fix or affix the various films. And I read, in fact, all of the examples that you raise as instances of works, as Tom so beautifully pointed out in his presentation, a work like L'Atlante as being that which precisely exceeds the capacity, and its endurance might in fact be ascribed to precisely this inability to fix or affix within a set of confines or contours, a work like Vigo's L'Atlante, but perhaps all of Vigo's oeuvre itself. And I wanted to start at the very beginning. And I was, again, I was thrown by Tom's reference to taking Lyotard to a baseball game. And because Lyotard appears right away, very early on, in which you start this work with the invocation of age and of death. And you start by claiming that cinema is already very old and it might in fact be dead. I want to point out this invocation of death, because death, of course, is one of the limits, one of the contours by which we measure human life and its afterlives. And in fact, what Tom was talking about too was a series of various afterlives invoked from this conversation between Krauss and Fried, and the invocation of Frank Stella and the invocation of Ted Williams before this, right? A whole series of lives and afterlives that are borne out and that continue into this day. The passage from A Cinema, in which you mentioned striking the match, Lyotard invoked in a seminar I took with him it must have been around 1990 at Yale University, and the ostensible title of this was Freud and Kant. And he brought up this exact moment of lighting a match, but he linked it to a very different conclusion than the one that he presents in A Cinema. In fact, he uses it to describe, and I was struck by the uncanniness of what Tom was describing with the scene of lighting the match as well earlier, and lighting the stove, because Lyotard uses that example as one that illustrates Freud's distinction between the death drive and the reality principle. Right? And for him, the alternative in the struck match is that one lights a stove to heat water, to boil it, to make coffee and make breakfast so that one can be alert and nourished in the pursuit of one's day, one's professional life, one's career. And so this moment of striking the match leads to a whole set of causalities, sequences and consequences that actually result in the extension of one's life, right? In the development and the advancement of one's life, professional success, the accumulation of prestige, respect, wealth, and all of the benefits that follow from that, social, personal, economic, financial, and so forth. Or one can be so taken by the match, by the flame, that one forgets to light the stove, and the match burns down to the fingers, and one is suddenly brought back to reality by the pain that one experiences in the heat that has left the match unused. And this he describes as the pleasure principle, right? That one interrupts an activity or an operation that would have led to potentially a whole series of anticipated consequences that could in fact frame one's own future life. And here the sudden realization of the pain, which is brought about by the indulgence of a certain pleasure, which would include both the warmth and the brightness of this match as it burns, leads to this moment of pain and the realization that one has lost that moment, that opportunity to set off a sequence of events. And for him, this is the pleasure principle, which of course Freud links to death. And Freud says ultimately, that pleasure is the momentary cessation of excitation, and that in fact death is the permanent, suspension of excitation. And it's one of the most cheerful books that Freud wrote, because we all end up happy and dead eventually. And so, we all get there. And that's so comforting, I would say, and reassuring. But the invocation of death, already about cinema being old, and then the idea that cinema may in fact be dead. And of course, we all know that in the history, or certainly in the rhetoric of the history of film, cinema has always been dying. It started out dying, and every few years it seems to be dying again. It was dying with the advent of sound. It died with color. It died with television. It died with digital cinema. Of course, it died with streaming services. It's in a perpetual state of dying, which may suggest that it is dead, or it is perhaps just merely always dying, as the case may be. But these things brought together for me both the idea of an excess, right? And by excess, if I may, one could add a concept like survival, right? The idea of that which not only exceeds, but lives on, lives after, continues to live in the way that Derrida and others have played with that term survivre, to live on, but also to survive after the end or limit of something. And to turn to an anecdote that appears very early on, which actually solved the mystery for me. So I have to thank you, Domietta, because it's such a small, but I realized disturbing glitch in my memory of the film Blade Runner, because I've been watching that film over and over and over again. And I was absolutely sure that Rutger Hauer says to Tyrell, "I want more life, fucker." And that's, pardon my French, sorry, Tom, but that's the word I remember him saying. And when I watched it recently, he says father. And I thought, all these years, I always thought that Rutger Hauer's speech was fucker. And it's a beautiful line, and it's a great line, and it's a generalized protest to the death sentence to which these replicants are assigned, right? As Derrida said in his reading of the death penalty, as mortals, we are all sentenced to die, right? We all die. But in the condition of the death penalty, we are all sentenced to death, which is the time and location of our death is prescribed to us in the legal system. And it made me understand the replicant here as those who are condemned to the death penalty, right? That 5-year limit, I believe, for that class of replicant, when it runs out, it ends. So this notion of "I want more life, fucker" is a generalized protest against the world and the universe, against a death that is not just imminent, but that is prescribed and whose date and time is already marked, as it were, in advance in the calendar. "I want more life, father" is such a disappointing censorship. It makes Judeo-Christian a phrase that should not be, in the context of that brilliant film, a protest to God, right? "I want more life, father." which inscribes Terrell, the maker of these replicants, as precisely the kind of godlike figure who controls the life and death of mortal beings. And so this idea of death in relationship to, in fact, what is the first chapter that you that starts the actual sequence of this remarkable book, to me is symptomatic of the idea that, in fact, before there is life, there is death. And death does not come, in fact, after life, but life is always perhaps the survival of death. That, in fact, death always comes first, and one survives death in and through life. And this is a point, I think, that in the sequencing of this book, I became acutely aware of. So that is my first point. And I'm mindful of time, so I will stop, because what Domietta's work does to me usually is a series of thoughts that come to me, and then I kind of can't stop and control myself. So I will try to do this as much as possible. And this also leads me to connect this notion of rhythm. And I think, you know, one of the things where I began was that we are, I think, increasingly become attuned to and aware of the role that rhythm plays as an element, if not a formal dimension, of cinema. And as I said earlier, I think part of the kind of continued reflection that we maintain on authorship, and what in a certain quaint form we used to refer to as the auteur, is also the capacity, as I said, among many filmmakers that we have revisited, to precisely master this element of rhythm. But given this emphasis on the beyond, on that which exceeds the limits or confines of a thing or an object or a life, as the case may be, I'm wondering if rhythm might also be a trope that takes us precisely outside of cinema. That rhythm is not only that which regulates cinema. And I say this somewhat in deference to your work, because I think something drives you beyond the specific limits or contours or discourses, as it were, of cinema, right? And perhaps rhythm is precisely that activity, that economy, that trope, that function that takes us beyond, that takes us outside of, and that when you invoke beyond, you are actually defining, as it were, a mechanism that rhythm puts into play. I will just say one last thing about Lynch, and something also that made me think about rhythm and the notion of passage. And I've been thinking about David Lynch for a long time. I recalled that at one point that I've watched all of his films with the exception of Eraserhead and the early shorts and the AFI film in real time, starting with The Elephant Man. So I can measure my own life from high school and beyond by when David Lynch's films appear, and how much I've hated and loved them over the course of my life. But when you talk on page 91 of this moment in, or you're reading, as it were, the structure of Mulholland Drive, and the idea that one of the things that Lynch is working on is a kind of subject differentiation. And of course, when you put it in those very specific terms, it makes absolute sense that we have been dealing through the Twin Peaks saga, you know, the network version and the return, in what I consider to be the precursor to Mulholland Drive, which is from 1997, Lost Highway, which also deals with a structure not unlike that of Mulholland Drive, in which you end up with somebody moving from one state to the other. In this case, it's Bill Pullman to Balthazar Getty. But you situate this discussion of Lynch in the chapter that you call Memory. And, you know, the idea of subject differentiation and the reading of a certain memory at the moment of death of the characters that Naomi Watts plays and as she is dying, she has a memory of something that never happens, right? That certainly never happens in the dimension or world in which she exists, but opens up, as it were, into a separate, what you call an alternative and simultaneous life. And I think that's absolutely right as a reading of Lynch, and makes me return to one of the tropes that I personally have been interested in with Lynch, is the terms of passage from one state to the other, how one gets from one place to the other. In Lost Highway, Bill Pullman has this terrible headache and then develops this weird lump on his head, and then he wakes up and he's Balthazar Getty, and of course it's Henry Rollins who discovers him, so it just gets weirder and weirder. But in in Mulholland Drive, it's this little cube, right? And the little key and the silencio and the Rebecca Del Rio performance of Roy Orbison in Spanish, and this moment in which everything turns. But the fact that you've put this discussion under the heading memory, right, makes me wonder, and this becomes a question that I will pose here that you can respond to here or elsewhere or at another time or when we continue our conversations individually, whether there is such a thing as a memory of an alternative simultaneous life, right? And this would return to my point, my discovery in reading your work, that perhaps death always precedes life. And if memory were always that which would mark or indicate a past, right? If we understand memory to be possible only because something has passed, and that would lead me to pose the question of whether in this framing of your discussion of Mulholland Drive, one could imagine a memory that is simultaneous, right? And a memory that is marked by an alternative, right? Which would which would be to say a memory that is not my own and a memory of something that has not yet passed, right? A memory of something that exists at this moment elsewhere. And it would be a certain kind of disavowal of memory as being proprietary, of being proper, which is to say that those memories would always be my own, and that those memories could be, in fact, those of another, like those replicants in Blade Runner, who are given a sense of their own subjectivity precisely because they have been embedded with memories that are not their own, that are, in fact, memories of an alternative life, in fact, that may be parallel, and to this day, as in the case of, for example, Rachel, happening somewhere else in another place. And I'm so conclude with just the idea that perhaps this operation could also be understood within the kind of mechanics, within the apparatus or machinery of rhythm, or of, as you call it, rhythmos. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aki. I will briefly introduce our next speaker, John Mowitt, who holds the leadership chair in the critical humanities at the University of Leeds. His publications range widely over the fields of culture, politics, and theory. In 2008, he collaborated with the composer Jared Fowler to transfigure his book, Percussion, Drumming, Beating, Striking, from a printed to a sonic text and performance, percussion, in quotations, as percussion. No quotations. Both his radio, Essays in Bad Reception, and Sounds, The Ambient Humanities, appeared from the University of California Press in 2011 and 2015, respectively. His most recent book, Offering Theory, Reading in Sociography, appeared from Anthem Press late last year. And in addition, he is a senior co-editor of our journal, Cultural Critique. So please join me in welcoming John Mowitt.
Thank you all. Thank you, Maggie. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I do have a title. It's a citation, and Domietta will recognize it. The Fleeting, Erratic Configuration of Child and Fire. I also wanted somehow to signal my respect, my admiration, my affection for the kind of work that Domietta does. I was tempted by following that phrase with the colon and the formulation an homage, but I think that's wrong. I think I'm going to call it a donation. Rhythmos is like one of those words. Actually, it is like two of those words, which is to say, as if immediately overdubbing my own utterance, that it exhibits certain qualities of what Freud in 1910 called Urworte, rendered by Alan Tyson as primal words. Doubtless the most prominent feature of words characterized as primal is not their vintage, but their non-Euclidean structure, a structure Freud sought to grasp through the German term Gegensinn, a typical morphological agglutination of Gegen and Sinn. Tyson renders this as antithetical meaning, losing, I think, the rhythm of the agglutination that both renders the German word a quasi-performative and a lexical autoimmunity. The sense of the against sense, not just an opposite sense, but opposed sense, an other sense. To say that the Greek rhythmos is like an urvot is to acknowledge the force of Domietta's phrasing when she notes in commenting on the theoretical reception of Benveniste's the notion of rhythm in its linguistic expression, that prior to its philosophical expropriation by Plato, rhythm meant in an unresolved oscillation both, quote, holding and flowing, end quote. This leads her both to a manner of flowing, a form of flowing, but also to flux and vibration, with a grave accent on measure and its beyond. That is, not the ebb and flow of opposing senses, but to when and where rhythm operates, where it happens to be. Now, I will apologize that some of what I'm going to do here has been said better by others already today, so bear with me as I repeat. In light of the post-colonial contestation of philology from Said to Mufti and Bhattacharya, it seems important not to linger, as does Benveniste in remarks on the function of language in Freudian theory, over Abel's mistakes, but over the simple fact that he, and Freud in his way, insisted on the geopolitical interval between Europe and Northern Africa, that is, in this case, Egypt. As I think many here will know, among Freud's various attempts to make sense of his Jewishness was his late study of Moses, in which he urged that we ground Christian Europe in a distinctly Egyptian embodiment of its deferring exclusion. At stake here, as Martin Banal and others have pointed out many years ago, is the measure of Europe itself. Where does it, can it, start and stop? This not entirely rhetorical question invites us to situate rhythm in general within and across this clash, but also to accept Freud's challenge to think this clash as formally active within the primary processes themselves. In the short essay on Abel, what Freud stresses about the dream work is that it does not know negation. It is unfamiliar with negation. On the face of it, this might be understood to compromise the Gegen of Gegenwart, but Domietta's subtle and sustained discussion of the linguistic chestnuts of metaphor and metonymy reminds us that negation might simply mean a form of differentiation that is neither an opposition nor an antithesis. In effect, oniric negativity is metonymic in principle. There is no substitute of a yes with a no. There is simply a displacement of what affirmation and negation fail to measure up to over and over. That this is entangled like the umbilicus of the dream in rhythm invites us to hear in the rhythm of images a theory of film spectatorship that, as in the days of yore, is indissociable from a theory of the subject, or at the very least, a psychical apparatus. From here, it is a short but decisive step to the proposition, echoing in Badiou and Deleuze, that the cinema thinks its own concepts. While I'm alert to the many reservations currently lodged against 70s film theory, and I do that in lowercase one word, its radicalization of the scale and scope of cinema studies has retained its value, if not its pertinence. Domietta's intervention, both as a theorist and filmmaker, is a stunning realization and defense, I think, of that proposition. That said, I'm hesitant about the status of images in this discussion. From where I sit, greater daylight between the screen and what is called the nymph in this text is required. Put differently and more pointedly, can the concept of the image withstand the pressure put upon it by rhythm beyond measure? To pursue the point, and here I'm going to reiterate some of the things that Tom has already directed our attention to. To pursue the point, I turn to several of the films one of the several films showcased in this study, Domietta's powerful reading of De Sica's Umberto De. She, and in fact, I know she has collaborated with Cesare on this project. So she and Cesare concentrate their lasers on the scene made remarkable by Bazin, re-edited in Tom's remarks, where we witness the maid Maria engaged in housework, and especially that moment in the scene where she reaches out with her toe to push close the door between the kitchen and the hall. Drawing on fecund insights from Luis Muraro and Giorgio Agamben, they get at precisely what complicates measure in domestic labor, showing that the cinema, and this film is not the only example, was already thinking ahead of a certain late Marxism on the primal power of reproductive labor. All this I agree with and admire greatly, but there are elements on the soundtrack of the film to which I think more attention could be paid. They operate from the edge of the image, by which they are audibly muffled. I cite only a few details. Some of them may be too obvious to mention. There is, and it is edited into this scene, a score composed by De Sica's frequent collaborator, Alessandro Ciccognini. Adorno's proposition that the Wagnerian motif was the herald of the film score, I think, is confirmed here, in that Ciccognini organizes his material less around themes, Umberto's themes, Fleig's themes, etc., and more around little motivic patterns, little cells, one of which sounds in the kitchen scene. There is also the singing lessons, rehearsals that drift back and forth between the acousmatic and the non-acousmatic territory in the film. But then elsewhere in the film, there is the watch, whose tick is a sign of value, one imitated vocally by Umberto. There's also the Benjaminian alarm clock that rings constantly and must be muffled under the blankets. The fact that Maria's workday begins not with a timepiece, but with a phone call, gesturing to the outside from the inside, that is reversed in the street sounds that pass inside from the outside, materializing in the medics that finally respond to Umberto's collapse. Back in the kitchen, a leaky faucet empties erratically into the sink. Even in the crucial moment of the extended toe, Maria is grinding coffee. The grinder is propped on her gestating womb, and it is operated by a crank, not unlike what powered early film cameras. And in its bean-resistant rotation, there's creating a pulse, an unsteady quarter note ostinato that appears to virtually wind out the leg. And not to put too fine a point on it, sonically instantiates the grind of social reproduction. Its relation to the score sets up a syncopation that, as the Greek word syncope implies, lets us hear a contraction, something falling out of measure. I think, as the old Gershwin song has it, she's got rhythm. Anahid Kasabian's reservations notwithstanding, there is a rhythm here that Maria doesn't in any clear way got. I'm thinking of what I earlier called the flux of the acousmatic singing. Given that the phonograph was in commercial production already in the 1890s, it is unclear where to situate the singing voice in the film soundscape. Or put differently, how many repetitions organize our listening? Indeed, the film produces a quite intricate texture of situating sounds diegetically and non-diegetically, the phone call, the dripping water, the grinding, and eventually the singing are all situated diegetically in a deacousmatized space. Cicconini's score is different. It is outside, off, and ways more radical than the street noise screened by the window, sharing with the singing a tenuous both inside and out. In the scene involving Maria's stretch, the score works rhythmically with the drip and the grind, but it also shifts the experience of rhythm behind the image to the space that opens within and beyond the diegesis as such. Here too, if I may borrow another of Domietta's formulations, we listen beyond metonymy, realizing that this space is another instance of the impossible flux, whose displacements conjoin the diegesis and another scene. The temptation is strong to take up those moments in the rhythms of images, but Domietta honors me by challenging my own thoughts on beating. But I will forgo this temptation and concentrate on two brief concluding points, both designed to accelerate the projection of rhythm. I think it's difficult for fans of the Western cinematic canon to not sense in the Ciclos Umberto Re an insistent and sustained intertextual engagement with Chaplin's A Dog's Life from 1918. Both are structured around a destitute man and his dog. Indeed, Fleich and Champ are similar small breeds led around insistently by what in England is called a lead. In both films, a man and a woman share the dog within the broad framework of heterosexual romance, and for what it is worth, Dog's Life ends in a kitchen, a scene of domestic social reproduction. With a provocation we have only recently begun to appreciate, although it's played for humor, a litter of puppies displaces Maria's child. But this invites, and this is my point in exaggerating its comparison, is a consideration of whether and how we should think about rhythm in the relay system of filmic intertextuality. The affectionate caress of the dog repeats a holding and a flowing. It seems highly pertinent. Touch, stroke, repeat. My final point is stated with concision in Said's last book, Speaking of Deaths. His own reading of Moses in Monotheism, titled Freud and the Non-European, where, commenting on the late style of Moses, he writes, Freud makes no effort to smooth out his story or give it a clear trajectory. This is perhaps because so much of the materials he is dealing as he chronicles the aftermath of Moses's legacy is uneven, as radically antithetical in its startling, sharp contrast between the founding outsider and the community he established, which also killed him, as the primal words he had studied and written about decades earlier. On a subsequent page, Said repeats the word antithetical, obliging us to consider that he means what he says. In effect, he too senses a post-colonial problematic tapped out in Freud's reading of Abel. If we take the non-Euclidean spacing of the Urwort seriously, then it ties both to the extimate figure of the non-European European and to the rhythmic character of cinemas analogously extimate to those of Europe and America. Different rhythms circulate here. Indeed, as Domietta proposes in her closing chapter, they drone over the terrain where the cinema composts into the medium of other media. The rhythmic character of this droning, this forming and deforming, calls out for attention similar to those flagged earlier around the folds of diegesis and the measureless expanse of intertextuality. It is my hunch, and it's little more than a hunch, that there is more at stake here than an image can image. Where this feels acknowledged by Domietta is in, despite her displacement of metaphor by what gestures beyond the metonymy, her rhythmic recourse to metaphor. In this text, often at telling moments, one finds words like crevice, crack, fissure. They seep, they resonate, they echo. Not presented as catachresis, what do they name? Are they hinting that the rhythm of images to be set flowing must have recourse to its opposite, its Gegensinn? Or is image merely the name of what rhythm avoids measuring? That's all I've got.
Our next speaker, our next panelist is Tiziana Terranova, who is Professor of Cultural Studies and Digital Media Theory at the University of Naples, L'Orientale, in Italy. Since the mid-1990s, she has been researching the politics of digital media networks from the perspective of critical theory, cultural studies, and contemporary Marxism. She's the author of Network Culture, Politics for the Information Age, published by Pluto Press in 2004, and also the author of two forthcoming books, After the Internet, Digital Networks Between Capital and the Comma, Semiotext, 2022, and Technosocial, published by Minnesota University Press in 2023.
Thank you very much, Cesare. It's such a joy to see you, Domietta, and also, the wonderful members of this panel. So I would like to thank Cultural Critique for the opportunity it has given me to join this discussion about Domietta's brilliant new book, The Rhythm of Images. It is a novelty for me and a pleasure to be in a Congress of film theorists, as pretty much the exception, I think, today. So I had the pleasure also and the honor to witness the inception of the research project that led to the writing of the book we are presenting today in 2017, when I spent a semester, thanks to a Fulbright scholarship, in the Department of French and Italian Studies at Northwestern University. During this period, I was exposed to Domietta's precious gift of being, as she puts it, both an image theorist and image maker, as she shared with me both her discovery of Roland Barthes and enthusiasm for Roland Barthes' recently published and translated course, How to Live Together, dating back to 1976 and 1977, and also had me accompany her in her research for a film, Garfield Park, USA, which came out in 2021. I would like to go back to How to Live Together as a point of entry into Domietta's rethinking of, as she puts it, cinema as a medium that gives us room to play with forms and their intensity, and also in the light of its relation to what she calls the new screen society, as part of my own interest in post-digital technosocial cultures. My entry point is thus Barthes' statement in the introduction to the course, which was delivered on January the 12th, 1977, where he states that there is a certain crucial and essential relation between research and fantasy. Research, he argues, implies a resurgence of certain desires and certain images that lurk within you, that want to be identified by you, sometimes your whole life, and often only assume concrete form thanks to a particular word, a word that becomes that which leads from the fantasy to its investigation. It is here that Barthes uses different images or to speak about the relationship between fantasy and research. On the one hand, he says, research is related to a mining of the fantasies. Research mines the fantasy like an open quarry through snatches of knowledge. However, the idea of fantasy as a quarry to be mined to produce knowledge research in ways that deplete it, possibly as a kind of a self-enacted extractivist strategy, is soon countered by another image. A fantasy can also function like a powerful, unwavering projector that isolates the brightly lit stage whereupon desire installs itself, leaving either side of the stage in shadow. The fantasy Barthes was interested in pursuing was that of living together. That is a life, a regime, a lifestyle, the Aida, diet. This was the brightly lit zone, which drove his fantasy and hence the process of research, which was framed, however, between two shaded zones where what he was not interested in lied. This included eremitism, that is total isolation. It also included two people living together, a pseudo-conjugal discourse that would follow his previous work in the Logos discourse, and the family system. And on the other side, macro groupings, large communes, phalansteries, convents, cenobitism. Neither plural, collective, nor individual, he was interested in something like his fantasy was that of solitude with regular interruptions, the paradox, the contradictions, the aporia of bringing distances together, the utopia of a socialism of distance. This brightly lit image, which seems like a theater stage, but it could also be a photograph or even the still image of a film, required in fact a setting or scenario or landscape where it could unfold as fantasy. A Mediterranean island, a terrace, the sea visible at a distance, 2 rooms for one's own use, close to a few friends, and somewhere to come together, maybe a shared library. This image, which sustained the fantasy that nourished the investigation that was research, however, also needed a word to be set into motion, to become a concrete form. And that word, encountered in the course of a chance reading, was rhythmos, or better, idiorhythmic, as in idiorhythmic clusters. This is the word that made it possible to transmute the fantasy and its landscape into a scene, into a field of knowledge, that is to gain access to things that can be learned. At the core of the idiorhythmic is a sense of rhythm, rhythmos, that preceded Platonic appropriation, a redeclination of the term in the sense of a strict regularity of forms. Rhythmos could be seen at work in ancient Ionian philosophy as the pattern of a fluid element, an improvised changeable form, which becomes an entry point into the exploration of forms of living together throughout the course, which escape individualism, couplism, familism, and collectivism. It was remarkable to me how Domietta's book took Barthes' rediscovery of rhythmos and this antecedent Benveniste as the staging of this image that reveals a landscape as a form of being together, and led him to a word that allowed to gain access to things that can be learned, as one of our starting points to explore the life of images, and specifically filmic images. I enjoyed the way she deployed rhythmos throughout the book as a means to get at a mode of being of the sensible that is informed by radical difference, where the passing irregular form of configuration, the manner of flowing that is rhythmos, can release a potential of the image in such a way that, like Maria in Umberto Dim, allows to find more time in time. If Barthes' image of the opposite of idiorhythmia, that is a mode of living together that respects the differences of individual rhythmos while also composing them, is that of the mother that drags her child behind her, Domietta's engagement with Maria in the Sica's Umberto D and Chantal Ackermann's Jean Dielsman sets the mother's violation of the child's rhythmos in the setting of the unbearable rhythms of domestic labor, and its breakdown by feminist revolution where potential can be found. This impulse to connect to rhythmos is something that I also find at work in Domietta's image maker role, especially but not only in her latest video essay, Garfield Park. As a scholar whose research has been mostly inspired, I'm so talking about myself, by the fantasy of a mode of living together that connects digital networks and computing to liberated forms of social life, I was, of course, moved to extend an inquiry into Ruth Moss in film to the domain of the new screen society, one dominated by the platform capitalism of social media, cloud computing, and smartphones. Here, the qualities of the digital image that artists and filmmakers such as Isaac Julian or Trin Mina commented upon as an expansion of the kind of liquid and mutant and fluid capacity of the image have become a kind of ordinary technosocial culture. It is a rhythm of a sharing process, which is dictated not directly by the platform as much as modulated by it, where modulation is just that, not just of the images, but also the forms of life that coalesce around image sharing. This is a new type of rhythm in the sense of standardized time, which works through interfaces, filters, and apps, but also through a new kind of social relations. The central role and operation of platform capitalism, as part of what Deleuze called control society, operates through the incessant translation of technosocial production of images, expressing themselves also as circulation, into something that can be measured according to the general equivalent of money, which has to go through datafication and machine learning. At the same time, money as a general equivalent of the value of the images is becoming something that has to do more with speculation about future than exchange, as in the Web 3.0 world or NFT tokenized art. This post-digital technosocial culture has apparently liberated social life from the strict and measured rhythms of disciplinary society, only to invent a new kind of rhythm for which I have difficulty to find a name. The rhythm of technosocial post-digital culture can undoubtedly be framed according to Jonathan Craig's characterization of 24/7. It is relentless, but within this pattern of ceaseless and continuous generation, it is possible to feel as bound to an exterior rhythm, as unforgiving as that exemplified by the mother striking her child. It is a mode of production and generation of images that combines the solitary rhythm of Jean Vivier and Umberto Diz Maria with a kind of technosocial fluid idiorhythm that mostly depletes the sensible, but also creates unprecedented patterns of entanglement, diffraction, and interferences. A kind of drive towards inseparability that makes the ongoing tendency remarked by Achille Mbembe, for example, towards separability, maybe a part of the mechanism of power and imaginary reaction akin to the disciplinary rigid regulation or rhythm. This tension between the relentless rhythm of the machine of platform capitalism and the request for ever more images is something that I would like to ask Domietta about. You know, what does she think it is this new rhythm of these digital machines of sharing? What kind of relation do they entertain to Ruth Moss in the sense that she gives to the study of film and the possible promise of technosocial idiorhythmic clusters as forms of life? Where is the rhythms to be found, Ruth Moss to be found in the contemporary post-digital image culture of reels as in TikTok? And what is the relationship to the virtuosity that is increasingly demanded of each of image production today? Thank you.
The next and final panelist is Amy Villarejo, who joined the faculty in the Department of Film, Television, and Digital Media at the University of California, Los Angeles in 2020, after serving on the faculty at Cornell University for more than 2 decades. She's the author of Lesbian Rule, Cultural Criticism and the Value of Desire, published by Duke University Press in 2003, Ethereal Queer, Television, Historicity, Desire, Duke 2014, and a number of edited collections and teaching resources, including most recently, the Oxford Handbook to Queer Cinema with Ron Gregg, published by Oxford University Press, 2022. Her research and teaching are now focused on television history and the talking head, the subject of her next monograph.
Cesare, thank you so much. And thank you
Thank
to
you.
Cultural Critique for hosting this. I want to give a shout out to Maggie, who's a contributor to that Oxford collection, a fantastic essay. So I'm pleased to be her editor, among other things. And it's such a pleasure to see all of you and to join in this conversation with folks that I've loved and admired for a long time. And so special thanks, Domietta, for the gift of this magical book. So I thought I would start with a poem. I'm keenly aware of my last name putting me at the end of these things always. And I will have a few things to say about that, but I thought I would start with a poem just to change the rhythm of things a little bit. It's a poem that gathers or maybe constellates several of the strands of Domietta's extraordinary text: domesticity, Chicago, dreaming, being, beginning, materiality, difference, duration, color, perception, indeed rhythm. And I could go on. But it will not surprise you that it comes from Gwendolyn Brooks. It's a poem that takes place in a kitchenette building. Its title is Kitchenette Building. And it echoes some of what John was noticing in the kitchen in Umberto D. So Kitchenette Building from 1963. And I once heard Gwendolyn Brooks read. I sat at her feet when she read, and I cannot do it justice, but nonetheless, here we go. We are things of dry hours and the involuntary plan, grayed in and gray. Dream makes a giddy sound, not strong, like rent, feeding a wife, satisfying a man. But could a dream send up through onion fumes? It's white and violet, fight with fried potatoes and yesterday's garbage ripening in the hall. Flutter or sing an aria down these rooms, even if we were willing to let it in, had time to keep it warm, keep it very clean, anticipate a message, let it begin. We wonder, but not well, not for a minute, since number 5 is out of the bathroom now. We think of lukewarm water, hope to get in it. So, cursing my last name, I anticipated being last and finding my text only repeating the insights of my colleagues who have already given eloquent voice to the enormously productive, invaluable insights of the rhythm of images. I even thought that Aki would have had something to say about all these cats. Where there is Vigo, there are cats to be discussed. But I did not anticipate a dog's life. So you surprised me there, John. Or indeed Tom's spectacular PowerPoint, which I found delightful. But in these closing minutes, I thought I'd just highlight 2 interrelated lines, not themes, but maybe forces of Domietta's work that I find invigorating and perhaps even essential. So the first is the way that making generates thinking. Re-editing Dorothy Malone's Red Dress Dance in Written on the Wind discloses what Lyotard, in what Aki has already mentioned, calls a kind of sterile motion, a rhythm that might allow us to find what is non-recurrent, that affirms difference as primary and absolute. Making her video essay, Philosophy in the Kitchen, opens for Domietta a counter-genealogy of film and labor that shapes her second chapter's impulse toward an undisciplined choreography, seeking the difference that resides in the image and finding a theory of rhythm
that exceeds measure. Of course, many scholars make work, though few well. And of course, the makers who most interest Domietta here, as she, like my colleague Chris Rivetto, erodes the subject of European cinema from within, are the preeminent artist intellectuals of the cinematic and the photographic. And we've heard their names already: Godard, Faruppi, Jeff Wall, Victor Bergen, Vigo, Eisenstein, Antonioni, Ackerman, etc., along all of our usual guys, and some very welcome feminists. But I would propose that Domietta's way of wondering has a unique genesis in a materially rhythmic engagement with image making, one that extends to the way she watches and ultimately analyzes cinema. Without wishing to mystify her work, I find in it something inexplicably moving, generative, and attuned, in addition to being critically forceful, erudite, and assured. And I'm still trying to grasp and appreciate the former to give it some thickness and some resonance, maybe even beyond metaphor. So the makers and the thinkers to whom Domietta turns are also, and this is my second point, rigorously political in their relation to the image, to form, to aesthetics, as is Domietta's text. I delighted in the seemingly casual ways she closes chapters or sections with the most forceful and sometimes damning turn to politics, strife, antagonism. Take the last line of the first chapter. It is also, she says, in this sense, that cinema's rediscovery of the echo of water in technology might constitute one of its most relevant political functions. She just end there, right? And one could point to a group of folks who have precisely taken up the political consequences of fluidity, from 20th century explorers and advocates to their 21st century readers, like Vincenz Heidegger and Nicole Starosielski, to name but two. Likewise, her conclusion to a major section in the second chapter on labor ends with this, cloaked in the form of a hunch. It is as if there were an inventiveness in proximity, or a proximity to be reinvented, she says. Not the correlation of distant images, but the distance, the divergence of adjacent ones, in a reworking of the relation between language and things that eludes equivalence or identity, an internal and dynamic creativity, a rearticulation of experience that in our socio-symbolic order doesn't come, she says, without strife. And so I think I would just want to close by appreciating that this Zoom constellation might be a form of that soft montage in which we are adjacent and nonetheless gathered without measure, beyond measure. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amy, for those beautiful provocations. And thanks so much to all of our panelists. Domietta, we really wanted to invite you to have a chance to respond to any of the comments, but I'm also being mindful of time.
Yes.
And unfortunately, the duration of this panel is not beyond measure. So I did want to.
I know. Let me just. I really like the idea of thinking about this this as a constellation of us coming together as not just expanding, but sort of rewriting and yes, it's sort of expanding the entanglements that I had tried to trace in the books. So in a way, this might be this kind of constellation, the particular the modality in which this constellation has been operating might constitute, I don't want to say an example, but might gives me, might offer like a sort of a contingent answer to Tiziana's question about how can we interrupt a certain relentless rhythm while sort of partaking of a platform culture that is also meant to intensify it. I just I know I don't think I could try and answer any of your incredible questions or connect to your comments in what is the 2 or 3 minutes that are left. But I want to say just a couple of things. I didn't realize that talking about baseball, I should have known better, talking about baseball, in the United States. Maybe that was the most risky bit, one of the riskier bits of that. And it's just the fact that, as you might imagine, I'm not deep into baseball while finding it an extraordinary game. It exceeds my capacities. That I turned to baseball as I didn't realize what a potentially compromising example.
No, it was just in fun.
No, thank you. Could have been, but by respect to baseball, and just maybe one more thing that again in a way might cuts across the kind of discursive field that's been produced today. I don't intend this. I never thought of this notion of rhythm as substituting as substituting other notions, as becoming some kind of, in a way, totalizing, is producing a totalizing, as becoming totalizing and able to, in a way, substitute itself to other very complex and nuanced understandings. I think I very much attended to this notion of rhythm, which is practice and theory of rhythm in the mode of a disjunctive displacement, of a displacement that doesn't repeat the same but produces interferences, and there is a way in which there is a kind of materialism of the encounter that is somewhere behind of this, with materialism of aleatory contingent encounters, and my question, one of my attempts was to produce a kind of text that can repeat itself without becoming the same, and can be really taken up and used and taken apart without how shall I say, without without having with a sense of accountability, but without having to come to terms with any form of totality. And I'm very excited, very thrilled to hear the ways in which you've actually engage with rhythm as productive of differences, and not as again, as a potentially totalizing or self-identical notion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Domietta. So I would like to invite all of the attendees now to pose your questions for Domietta or any of the panelists, or just share general comments, remarks. I see we have had one raised hand, I believe, for over an hour. So Yimon Wong, are you there? And then Kelly, where is next? Yimon, are you there? Yes, there you are. You need to unmute. Iman, you need to unmute.
Perhaps they're not there. I gave them permission to talk, but so that's why they appeared like that.
Oh, I see.
So I changed the settings to allow people who raised their hands to talk.
Maybe you could change the setting so anyone in the room who's an attendee also has permission, just in the interest of time. I mean, if Iman is not there, maybe we could move to Kelly. Are you able to talk?
Yes, I think
Okay,
so. I don't know if I can talk as eloquently. I don't know if you can see me. This is very weird, I have to say. I can see you, but you can't see me. So, or maybe you can, who knows in this Zoom land. But thank you ever so much for this amazing panel. And thank you also, especially obviously to Domietta's amazing work. Not just this book, but I think that, you know, the research that she produces is nothing short of groundbreaking. All right, so an attempt to kind of coalesce some thoughts in a coherent fashion after the couple of hours we've been on. Two threads, or perhaps we can call them rhythmotic murmurings, if I can be so pretentious, have emerged for me in the different things that I've heard, and two of them surround measure. One of them, of course, is the question of relation. When we talk about measure and rhythm, or going beyond, I think also we are talking about ways in which we relate, or we have a question of relation, so inviting engagement and entanglement. And curiously for me, although this has come up on the question of age and death, I'm also very much taken by the idea of water. That seemed to have also been the second thing that came up a lot. So these things, the idea of measure, relation, and this idea of the fluidity or of water, these are the two things that came up. And I did want to ask, a lot of the examples that have been used have been from filmmakers and names that perhaps we are very familiar with, but I'm wondering perhaps if we could turn to a filmmaker who's much more contemporary. And I was thinking of Lynn Ramsay and the way in which water and relation dominate almost all of her films in many ways. And I was wondering if Domietta has ever had any thoughts about Lynn Ramsay's work in relation to those two threads of perhaps relation and water.
Thank you, Kelly, and nice speaking to you for the first time. We've been in touch by email, but Lynn Ramsay's been one of the filmmakers that I certainly thought about, though I've never worked on. I have never worked on specifically. What I find most interesting, though, and this is coming from her work, but also from your intervention, is this capacity to, and it revolves around relation, around, and you mentioned entanglement, about the capacity to image, which is more than visualize, is to perform relations that that don't rely on pre-existing terms, relations not between entities, but a capacity to image contingent relations as primary and as primary with rather than secondary with respect to what they bring together, and thinking, and I'm maybe free associating. There is a little bit of free association, or maybe not. These relations, and this is where water in a way comes in, are wave-like relations, which takes me back to something that Akira, who's I think unfortunately has left, but other colleagues in the panel spoke about a place and location and a certain. I believe and this is sort of a retrospective interpretation of my work now that I'm working more closely with Karen Barad's work and work on entanglement. There is a way in which the films I attended to and that I was engaging, I was actively, performatively engaging. Some of this, I realized that some of these films, some of what some people might not recognize fully, I've to some extent transformed these films by writing about them. But the films I engaged with, or at least the sequences I engaged with, they are more interested in sort of registering interferences, in registering what we might call like a wave-like behavior of matter rather than their particle behavior. So there is an excess with respect to locality, and whether it's a locality, it's a place in time or in space, that I think is not contingent upon any direct representation of water, but that certainly has in the background or underneath a kind of understanding of the sensible as composed of relations rather than entities. And these relations are that's why I was mentioning sort of, and I had to say in mind, materialism of the encounter. These relations come into being under particular circumstances. Some of them take, these arrangements take more of a solid form. The challenge I was looking for in the works I analyze, how do you how can something take form without, and that's where Ruthmos come in, how can something take form and repeat itself? Because even the form of Ruthmos is singular but unthinkable without repetition. Once is already twice. So how can these forms which are fleeting and ephemeral, still gain some sort of persistence, which is something other than fixity. So how can configurations take form which are profoundly relational? The Ruthmos in this case it's true. It's in a way it's beyond the image. Image might not be able to account for what Ruthmos does, also because Ruthmos constitutes itself in the readings I pursue at the cusp of different sensorial differentiations, which are also informed by technology. But going back to a configuration as a self-deferring, Ruthmos is a self-deferring, internally fissured configuration, and that is, how can it persevere without solidifying? how can it persevere? How can it take form without taking the kind of form for which fixity and stability and cohesiveness are important qualifiers, are constitutive. And I think thinking relationality and water, thinking the relationality and water brings me to imagine a cinema as more as a diffraction grid than a sort of a geometrical kind of projecting apparatus. And it is so that it is through a constant transformation which entails some reduction of what is seen or heard, but also an expansion through a further engagement. That forms might remain fleeting. There is a kind of contradiction here in the idea of having a fleeting form that is also recurrent, that repeats itself. But I think this contradiction gains a different kind of emergence, a different light. Again, if we don't have entities and clear-cut locations, point-like locations in mind, but fluid relationalities and diffraction, interference patterns rather than trajectories. Kelly, I don't know if this sort of address some of your I know it's a partial way of addressing your question, but
no, yeah, absolutely.
It didn't miss it completely.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. And actually, it made me, as you were speaking, it made me think also of another filmmaker who uses water in the way that you talk about in terms of location, which is Lucrezia Martel.
Oh, of course. Yes.
It runs in the way of what you were saying then in terms of it needing a space or a geospatiality in order to work. So I don't know, maybe there's something with women and water that we still need to pick through. Thank you, Domietta.
Thank you. Thank you.
I see we have a question in the chat from Chris Rivetto, which was posted quite a while ago. Why should death come first as an origin? Doesn't rhythm undermine a sense of origin? And I believe Chris is still in the room, so you're welcome to elaborate on that question, Chris, if you would.
I think that was more directed to Akira. And so, because that was his statement, so he's gone. I'm fine if anybody wants to talk about it, but it's sort of like the absence, and he's going to prove his point to me. So there we go.
I couldn't quite answer that question because I would have I completely what he says about the way in which the book starts and this switch that I make, which is maybe is not a switch from death to life, I mean, I take his point. I wouldn't have quite formulated what he said the way he did, and so I cannot speak on his behalf. But at least I would say that certainly what I had in mind, and I'm not trying to combine to create a synthesis between death and life, but certainly is a ghostly kind of life. And again, this ghostly kind of life, also is a life that lives in a memory, in a time that's not quite past. So it's when he was also what he was saying about memory as being connected, expressing something that has passed. There is, I think, a certain ghostliness in marking the switch, from death to life, that allows for memory not to have ever quite passed, and to be open to reconfigurations, which doesn't mean that the past as it happened is erased or marks were not left on bodies and screens, but and yet there is, how shall I say, there is more to the past and those to memory than the past that was once present. And I think with this, with working with and through Ruthmos, I was trying to find a way not to actually to displace, so at least to the very least, to displace this sort of any opposition between death and life, and through a kind of sort of ghostly, always ghostly presence of configurations that are fugitive and yet also persistent. Chris, but you might have had something else in mind. Again, this is the best I could do not to answer the question you asked, Akira.
No, I think your answer was wonderful. And I had more of a bone to pick with Kara's statement. So thank you.
Thank you.
He left too soon. I know Cesare had a question he wanted to pose, and if anyone else in the audience has a follow-up question, please just feel free to raise your hand or post in the chat.
Yes, I do have a question, and I want to pick up on something that actually ran through all the panelists' responses to your book, Domietta. It was probably best encapsulated by Akira Lippit, when he said, I think verbatim, rhythm, that is your notion of rhythm, takes us outside of cinema. Now, yes. John Mowitt said something that I think is in connection with this. Can the image withstand the pressure? Can the image withstand the pressure put upon by your notion of rhythm? Not verbatim, but something like that. And Tiziana started by pointing out the outside, the conditional possibility of your work, by pointing how reading and reading together, Bach's book on, lectures on living together, how that in fact comes before your work. I mean, how that was the conditional possibility. Your work started there and ends there in a sense. So in many different ways, everybody here has at one point or another pointed out that this notion of rhythm that you are working with, that you're working out, really goes well beyond the realm of images. Not that it leaves them behind, but it goes well beyond. So in that spirit, I want to ask a question regarding your writing. And how it is that rhythm, in fact, connects up with that. Because one of the many things that your book has made me think more about is the very peculiar epistemological, affective thing that happens when we write about moving images, using words to talk about images, using words to talk about moving images in particular. There is a certain type of impulse that many of us have. You have it for sure. I have it too, but many others, to want to describe, re-describe a sequence in a film. And here, going back to the sequence that everybody has brought up, the one of the maid in Umberto D. I mean, you can read Bazin, Deleuze, as well as the characterizations that you give of that sequence and the characterizations that panelists here have given of that sequence. They're completely different. They're rather quite different from each other. So there is an impulse there of rewriting the film, rewriting that sequence, that is doing it again, but differently and in writing. So I'm wondering how this very complex operation of images and words relates to this notion of rhythm that you wrote.
Thank you. Thank you, Cesare. Yes. Well, it's quite a complex question. Also because in order to answer it, I need to further to produce more words so I think let me start by saying that with this notion of rhythm, yes, this rhythmus, the way I understood it or I played with it, emerges, I don't want to say begins, but emerges outside of cinema, because to the very extent that cinema, I conceive of cinema as already being outside of itself. That is, for instance, I spend a lot of montage is one of my, the workings of montage. I spend a lot of time talking about montage. Montage is not only what we do, or only what cinema does, or what we do when we watch a film. There is there is and this has been it's montage is and here I'm borrowing from something that the Karabarad says not about cinematic montage, but actually about the very process of mattering. But I think of montage as a cutting together apart, actually a folding or refolding. That is never absolute, never quite doesn't quite begin in any absolute terms, and never quite ends. So Ruthmos, in a way, was born outside of cinema, and yet there is a way in which perhaps it can help us think of cinema as being certainly not just in cinema, not just in movie theaters, or not just on our screens, and not just cinema being as a kind of dispersed common creativity that cuts across different media, and that nonetheless, I mean, cinema, it's also, it's 21st century cinema. I don't want to dehistoricize it. There is something, of course, if I go back to it, there is something that cinema in its obsolescent quality, perhaps always obsolete in quality, has done that is specific, and that I just don't want to again flatten out. But what cinema was doing or can do, because I conceive of it in terms of entangled relationalities, cannot be quite isolated to a particular place or to a particular location, whether again it's a movie theater, or even it's a streaming device, or what we are doing now on Zoom. In a way, I use Ruthmos helps me or pushed me to think of cinema as, and I don't want to say as a synonym for life, but certainly as a cinema as having and playing in an expanded sense, cinema in an expanded sense, a major, crucial role in the way in which in producing differentiations, the very differentiations through we come into being as being images, and also more than images, but also being images. I wouldn't even when we're not in front of a Zoom screen, I would be tempted to say, and I'm not the first, that we are images even there. Ruthmos, because it's a questioning of boundaries and of permanence and of enclosures, cannot be, I would say, for me, cannot be just and cannot be made just of images as visual images. It's actually what emerges and what comes to be constituted when these these impossible fissures, sort of these gaps between different sensorial and mediatic modes are engaged. So writing is writing about writing about moving images is also a way of doing cinema, but not because I remember Deleuze criticizes Godard when he said, Godard saying, you know, we were all training to do things, you know, we were critics and we were all training to become filmmakers. And at the end of the cinema 2, Deleuze says, actually, you know, you do things just by doing theory. You're doing things you're doing by using concepts. And so I think Ruth Moss points to this, to a kind of doing that inhabits, constitutively inhabits areas of interference, where viewing and making and writing and filming, it's not that they cannot be distinguished, but they come together in configurations that are productive, not always, but at times of original clusters. And these original clusters or entanglement are more than the sum or the correlation of pre-existing entities or modes, but can happen to be, can end up being for a moment or for forever something that has that is endowed with a certain singularity. And this singularity I very much through Ruth Moss conceive as quite far as inimical even to the proper, to propriety, to radical fixed pre-existing forms, to forms that are in a way Ruth Moss points to a moment phantasmatically when Ruth Moss points to a moment when it's one of the moments in which it's obvious that aesthetic configurations are not simply propedeutic to certain kind of political formation, but the aesthetic and the political are related as reconfigurations in an unmediated. I'm talking about the classic, you know, the mediation between two. That it's not even about of certain for media mediating between the aesthetic and the political, or Ruth Moss. It's Ruth Moss itself, or what happens to Ruth Moss with Plato points to in a way to the emergence, to a profoundly political emergence, to an emergence of forms that is always profoundly political, that cannot be isolated from the political.
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful note to end on.
Yes, yeah.
And we are unfortunately over time.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Domietta. Congratulations on this beautiful, brilliant book. And thanks so much to all of our panelists. Please join.
Thank you very much for everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I can't thank you enough for doing this rhythmic work with me today, and really bringing into being yet another book, a new configuration, and I'm very grateful and very honored, and for your generosity and sheer patience. Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Mowitt. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.